Wyoming Territory, 1881. Dust rose from the canyon trail like smoke from a dying fire, swirling around the heads of cattle as they pressed forward, hooves grinding stone and dirt into a thunder that carried for miles. The drive was small, barely 60 head, a pitiful herd compared to the 1,000-strong rivers of beef driven south by men with money and iron at their backs. But to Clara McGraw, this herd meant everything. It was all she had left. The morning sun burned low and merciless across the jagged ridges, turning the sky the color of scorched brass. And in that hard light, they appeared, 7 riders fanned across the trail like a gate of iron. Black hats, dirty dusters, horses lathered with sweat. Outlaws. The lead rider grinned through broken teeth, lifting his hat as though greeting a lady in town. His voice carried sharp through the canyon walls. A widow with a herd. Best hand it over before someone gets hit. Laughter followed, a cruel and echoing sound. Clara McGraw did not flinch. She sat tall in her saddle, her black mare shifting beneath her, nostrils flaring at the smell of sweat and gun oil drifting off the men. Clara's face was lined not with years but with grief, her eyes gray and unyielding. She wore no ribbons, no rings, no softness, only a battered hat and the plain duster of a working hand. She could feel every ounce of their eyes pressing against her, weighing her, measuring how far they could push before she bent. She knew that look. She'd seen it on creditors after her husband died, on ranchers who thought they could buy her land cheap, on townsfolk who whispered that a woman had no business running cattle. But Clara McGraw had not buried her husband to bury herself. The cattle lowed nervously, their movement shifting as if they sensed the wall of men blocking their way. Her 2 ranch hands, boys barely grown, looked to her for direction. One clutched the reins so tight his knuckles whitened, the other swallowed hard, too frightened even to speak. The outlaw leader leaned forward in his saddle, spitting into the dust. "You got no brand worth fighting for, widow. No husband to back you. Just give us the herd, and maybe we'll let you ride home in one piece." Clara's hand brushed against the worn leather of her saddle scabbard where the stock of her Winchester rifle rested. She didn't move to draw it, yet. Instead, she let the silence linger, her eyes fixed on the man like she was carving his face into memory. Her voice, when it came, was steady as the earth. "These cattle are mine. They'll see market, with or without your permission." The gang barked laughter again. One of them spat, another slapped his thigh in delight, as though this was some grand joke. The leader shook his head slowly, the smile never leaving his face. "You hear that, boys? Widow thinks she's a drover. Thinks she's got steel in her spine. Maybe she don't know the law of the trail. What we take, we keep." Clara said nothing. She let her mare step forward, the iron shoes striking rock with a sound that cracked sharp through the canyon. The herd shifted behind her, restless, dust swirling in golden sheets. For a moment, the outlaw leader's eyes narrowed. He'd seen defiance before, but there was something else in her gaze. A steadiness. A weight. She didn't look at him like a woman pleading for mercy. She looked at him like a hunter eyeing prey. The gang shifted uneasily, though they tried to mask it with chuckles. One of the younger riders leaned toward another and whispered, "She don't scare easy." The leader scowled at that, lifting his hand to silence his men. "Listen close, widow," he said, his voice dropping low and mean. "Out here, mercy runs thinner than creek water in July. Best you turn that herd around before we—" He didn't finish. Clara's hand moved, slow but sure, gripping the Winchester by the worn stock. The rifle cleared the scabbard in one smooth pull, glinting in the sun like a blade of judgment. The gang fell silent, every grin wiped clean. The laughter died in their throats. Clara McGraw leveled the rifle across the saddle horn, her eyes never blinking. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. The canyon did not breathe until someone moved, and she made sure it was her. Clara slid the Winchester a hair lower across the saddle horn and let the mare step forward, step by step, as if she were easing a frightened child through a doorway. The leader's grin thinned. His horse tossed its head. Dust lifted off the trail in pale veils and clung to beards, to eyelashes, to the long-muscled flanks of every animal, and in that gritty hush even laughter seemed like a thing that could crack a stone. "You can shoot, widow," one of the riders called, making his voice high and mocking. "Or you just like the feel of a gun in your hands?" Clara did not answer. She gave a small whistle. Behind her, the boys edged the herd into motion. Hooves began to drum again, slow and stubborn, 60 heartbeats tied to her will. The outlaws angled their mounts to press the trail shut. Clara didn't blink. "Let us by," she said. "You've already wasted a good morning." It was not bravado. It was the sound of a woman setting a table and placing a plate. The leader chewed on his smile and then flicked his hand. 2 riders peeled off, leaving a narrow seam in their line. He wanted her to pass so the game could go on. Wanted to watch how she'd hold it together when he needled from the edges, when he pinched the herd with fear and night whispers. She could read him like a fence map. She rode through the seam without haste, the Winchester steady, the mare's ears pointed forward. The herd swelled behind her, nervous bodies rubbing and bumping, the boys murmuring low to keep them calm. The outlaws turned and followed, falling like dark birds onto a current. No shots, no blood, just the pressure of 7 men who had time and appetite. The trail led out of the canyon into broken hills where sagebrush bled its clean, bitter scent and the earth showed its bones. Far ahead lay a string of dry draws and a crooked creek that sometimes remembered water, and beyond the market road, thin as a scar on the land, where a fair price might be won for men who smiled with their mouths and counted with cold fingers. Between here and there was a wilderness of excuses to quit. Clara knew them all. A wind came up, tugging at her hat brim, and with it came a memory she never invited but always welcomed. His hands, brown and steady, cupping hers on the rifle in the back pasture when the cottonwoods were heavy and the grass was knee-high. Seth had stood behind her, his breath warm on her neck, and said, "Breathe with the dust, not against it. Let the land tell you its heartbeat." She'd laughed at that. Who listens to dirt? And he tapped the small of her back and said, "You do. You will." Then he tossed a bottle in the air. She could still hear the glass burst into sunlight under her bullet, could still feel the thrill that rose inside her like a second spine. Before he died, Seth taught her how to rest a rifle on a rolled blanket, how to squeeze and not jerk, how to see the space between heartbeats and live inside the thin country. Miss Clara, one boy, Tommy, rode up beside her, voice wobbling as he glanced back at the riders who drifted along their flanks. "What have they?" "So will morning," she said, and touched his sleeve. They pushed through the heat of afternoon, the hills climbing and falling like tired lungs. The outlaws tested her with little things, a whoop too close to the remuda, a scatter of stones down a slope that made the herd bunch and mill. Clara's hand lived on the Winchester, but she never lifted it to her shoulder. She spoke to the cattle instead, low and patient. She let them listen to her voice and leaned toward it like thirsty men lean toward shade. At sunset the sky bled itself empty and the land cooled. They made camp against a rock spine where the wind was kinder. The boys, hands shaking, built a thin fire with cow chips and kept it mean. Clara walked the perimeter, counting shadows the way a banker counts coins. She strung a narrow drag fence of poles and rawhide across the open side of the rock, enough to slow a night drift, not enough to pen them if panic hit. Sleep would be a rumor. The outlaws settled somewhere beyond the scrub, their cigarette tips winking like red insects. Someone laughed again, softer now. When the stars showed, the leader's voice slid in from the dark as if he were sitting beside her. "You'll break, widow. Every cattle drive breaks." Her reply left her mouth like a prayer that refused to kneel. "Not this one." Tommy and Luke took the first watch. Clara took the second and the third, and when dawn peeled up out of the east she was still awake, boots dusted white, eyes gritty but clear. Twice in the cousin hours of night she had risen to walk the drag fence, and twice she'd found the rawhide strands nick where a knife had kissed them. The boys hadn't noticed. She tied the cuts with her own hair ribbon and left the ribbon ends hanging there like a dare. By noon they came to the crooked creek and discovered it had kept its memory of water in only 2 shallow pans. The rest was high talk and cracked mud. The cattle surged toward the pans, and the smaller calves were shoved into the ring of bigger bodies until one slipped in, flailed, and began to drown in chocolate muck. Clara swung down, boots in mud, cold up to her shins, arms wrapped around a calf's slick chest while its eyes rolled white. The herd pressed and bellowed, and the ground made ugly sucking sounds around her as if it were trying to keep what it had taken. Tommy yelled. Luke waved his hat and shouted at the bigger steers to give space, but fear had deafened them all. Clara dug her heels into the bottom as far as it would let her, lifted with her back and her breath, and got the calf's head up. It coughed like a dying man and blew mud across her cheek. She laughed, which sounded like a sob that had changed its mind. On the slope, silhouettes watched. One of the outlaws clapped slowly, the sound carrying on the wind. "Look at that, boys. The widow saves a calf. Maybe she thinks kindness keeps bullets away." Clara did not look up. She tied the calf to a scrub limb for a moment until its legs remembered themselves, then waded out, boots heavy, When she reached her mare, she saw that a canteen had been slit open while she was in the mud, then water bleeding into dust. Someone had crept close enough to cut it and vanish. She replaced the canteen with one from the saddlebag, took a shallow swallow, and felt nothing but the fact of the swallow. That afternoon a dust devil walked through their column and slapped hats and patience. One of the steers broke sideways, then two more followed, and suddenly a dozen heads were angled toward nowhere. Clara spurred across their faces, swinging the Winchester by the barrel like a baton. Not a threat, but a command. She didn't fire. She clicked her tongue in that soft, short rhythm Seth had used when he wanted a team to bend without breaking. She showed them the line with the shape of her body. They took it. The dozen became 10, then 8, then part of the river again. Behind her, from some hill she couldn't see, the laugh returned. "You'll break, widow. Wear out your lungs," she called back. "I've got cattle to wear out." They camped again in a cleft where the rock made a natural cup. No fire this time. The boys ate cold beans and tried hard not to show their fear by the way their hands mangled the tin. Clara walked the rim. In the violet dark the land felt like a held breath again. Once she stopped and let herself feel the loneliness that came like a slow river when the work went quiet. She tasted Seth's name but didn't say it. Names could bring storms. She lay on her blanket with the Winchester across her chest and watched the sky turn black and then deeper black. Twice the herd shifted with the soft sound of leather pulled through a ring. Once she heard a rock tumble, too careful to be a spooked rabbit, not clumsy enough to be a cow. She smiled without humor and sat up. There, at the lip of the cleft, she found the drag fence cut clean through. The rawhide dangled like a vein. The rider stayed just far enough behind to remain a question. Every time Clara turned in the saddle or lifted her spyglass at dawn, there he was, perched like a crow on the ridgeline, always alone, always still. He never approached, never signaled, never broke his quiet vigil. The land swallowed his details. A wide-brimmed hat. A long coat. No brand on his horse. No trail dust rising where he rode. Just a shape that didn't belong, watching with patience that felt more like warning than curiosity. At first, Clara figured he was with the gang, a scout meant to rattle her nerves or count her cattle. But something in the way he moved, or didn't, made her unsure. He never joined the outlaws when they hooped and circled. He stayed distant even when the gang pressed close. She tried to convince herself he was just a drifter with nowhere better to be. But the land didn't allow such things. Not out here. Out here, everyone had a reason for where they stood. She didn't tell the boys. Tommy was already wrung tight, and Luke had started muttering prayers under his breath at sunset. There wasn't room in their heads for more ghosts. Instead, Clara kept him in the corner of her eye and the center of her thoughts. If he was waiting to strike, she'd be ready. And if he wasn't, then she wanted to know why he watched and what he waited for. By the 5th day, the herd had thinned. 2 calves had gone lame and were left behind to fate. Coyotes had begun shadowing the trail like predators. The land was nothing but rock, glare, and grit now, a pale wasteland where even the sun seemed tired. Clara rode with her hat brim pulled low, skin blistered, mouth dust-dry, heart steady. Then, on a night too quiet for its own good, Luke disappeared. They'd made camp near a cluster of wind-bent junipers, the kind that creak when they're thinking. The herd was restless. Clara had walked the line twice before turning in, boots still on, rifle across her lap. But when she woke before dawn to change watch, Luke's blanket was cold. His saddle was gone. So was one of the best horses. Tommy stumbled over with sleep still in his eyes. "Maybe he just went to check the ridge," he offered, voice hopeful and trembling. "No," Clara said flatly. "He went to sell his soul." She found the note under a rock, scrawled on the back of a receipt for oats. Asterisk too dangerous. Not worth a ride. The gang offered gold, asterisk that was all. No apology. No name signed. Tommy stared at the note like it was a snake. He's really gone. Some men leave slow. Some leave all at once. He was the second kind. They packed in silence. Clara wrapped the note and tucked it into her coat without ceremony. She didn't need reminders. The trail would give her plenty. By noon, the land began to shift. The wind picked up first, playful at first, then sharp enough to sting. The sky turned the color of old bones, and the sun vanished like it had ducked behind something too large to name. Dust lifted in curtains, then in ropes, then in walls. Clara cursed and wheeled her mare, yelling to Tommy to tie his scarf over his mouth and keep low. The storm didn't ask permission. It came like a judgment. Within minutes, the cattle panicked. The lead steers tried to push into the wind, then turned and stampeded blind into the dust. Clara spurred her mare after them, her cries swallowed by the roar of sand and sky. The world narrowed to noise and brown blur. She couldn't see Tommy, couldn't see the herd, couldn't see the ground. Only the wind, and the pain in her eyes, and the chaos of hoofs tearing at the earth. Then the gunshots started. Sharp cracks from the flanks. Too many, too precise. The gang had waited for this, used the storm as cover. Clara felt the shape of it all even if she couldn't see it. They were cutting cattle out of the herd, driving them sideways, making off with what they could. She yanked the Winchester from its scabbard, coughed dust, and dug her heels into her mare. Through the storm, she glimpsed shapes, men on horses, barely visible, like shadows stitched to the dust. She fired once, a warning. Then twice, a threat. Then a voice sliced through the wind, close to her left ear. "Give it up, widow. You're riding into a grave." She turned toward it, the rifle leveled. A rider emerged from the storm, laughing, black scarf around his mouth, pistol high. He didn't see her in time. Clara's shot came clean from the saddle, mid-gallop, her knees tight against her mare's ribs. The Winchester bucked once, and the rider folded forward like his bones had disappeared. He tumbled off the horse, vanished in the dust. The storm held the silence for one long second, then the wind screamed again. Someone shouted, "She hit him." From the saddle. Another voice, panicked, "That ain't supposed to happen." The herd thundered past, blind and bellowing. Clara spun the mare in place, scanning for more. The dust clawed at her face. Her chest burned. She chambered another round with practice speed. No one came for her in that moment. The gang, shocked by her precision, had pulled back. The trail was chaos. Cattle scattered. Tommy was nowhere. And in the far distance, through a slit in the storm, she saw him again. The rider on the ridge. Still. Watching. Only now. He was closer. Only now. His horse was turned toward her. And she felt it deep in her ribs like a drumbeat. He had seen the shot. And now, he was coming. The storm passed like a curse lifted, sudden, breathless, and leaving behind a silence too wide to measure. Dust lay in drifts, powdering the canyon floor like snow from a dirty sky. The herd was scattered, calves bawling from the wrong ends of the trail, steers limping, flanks streaked with sweat and fear. Clara sat her mare in the stillness, the rifle laid across her lap, and listened to the echoes. Nothing moved except her breath. She found Tommy first, coughing behind a rock shelf, his cheeks caked in dust and blood from a shallow cut on his brow. His horse was gone. He stood when he saw her, shaking, and hugged her like a child who'd wandered too far into the woods. She didn't hug back, just gripped his shoulders and said, "You did right. You stayed low." Together they rode through the storm's wreckage, gathering what they could. Half the herd, dazed and wide-eyed, 2 water barrels cracked from stray shots, and the body of the gang rider she'd shot from the saddle. He lay crumpled like a scarecrow emptied of pride, revolver still in hand. Clara dismounted, took the gun, and left his eyes open. Let the sun judge him. At twilight, the silence broke. Hooves, slow and deliberate, crunched through the dust. Clara lifted the Winchester, eyes narrowed. From the edge of the ridge came the figure that had haunted their trail for days, no longer shadowed, no longer distant. He stopped 10 yards from her. Tall, coat frayed at the cuffs, face hidden behind stubble and the brim of a slouched hat. He sat like a man born to the saddle, casual but coiled. His horse, a gray with one blind eye, exhaled and waited. "Name?" Clara asked, voice sharp enough to draw blood. He tilted his head, and when he spoke, it was quiet thunder. "Jonas Hale." Tommy gasped. Clara did not. The name carried weight. In every border town and saloon whisper, Jonas Hale had been the ghost they spoke of when shots rang truer than seemed fair. A marksman turned drifter, they said. A bounty hunter who'd walked away from the game after burying too many names. Some swore he'd once shot a coin from a man's fingers at 80 yards, mid-toss. Others said he'd disappeared after refusing to kill a child for bounty. "Thought you were dead," Clara muttered. "I was. Then I got tired of staying that way." She didn't lower the rifle. "Why trail us?" "Curiosity," he said. "Turned to something else when I saw you shoot that bastard from the saddle." "You with the gang?" His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "If I was, we'd be talking from opposite ends of a grave." Tommy stepped forward, eyes wide. You really Jonas Hale? Jonas turned to him, voice like gravel rubbed smooth. Used to be. Clara finally lowered the rifle. Not in trust, never that. But in understanding. They set camp beneath a narrow bluff, a crippled moon crawling across the sky. Clara boiled what little water hadn't been ruined, her hands moving like machines built for war. Jonas sat across the fire, sharpening a knife that didn't need it. Neither spoke. Tommy snored softly, curled up in his coat like something trying to be forgotten. You came for a reason, Clara finally said. I came because I've seen what happens when wolves circle a soul alone. I'm not alone. Jonas looked to the boy, then to the half-gathered herd. You're not enough. The silence between them was long. Clara stoked the fire with a snap branch and said, If you're riding with us, understand this. We ain't just herding cattle. We're hauling ghosts, promises, and everything else no one wants to carry. That trail don't forgive. I've walked worse. She studied him for a long beat, then gave the smallest nod. It wasn't trust, but it would do. Over the next 2 days, Jonas proved himself. He could read sign like scripture, could mend a broken stirrup with a knife and prayer, and could shoot a tin cup off a stump without breathing hard. The herd rallied under their push, the boys drew breath with a little more ease, and the canyon ahead began to narrow toward Market Road. But the gang wasn't finished. On the 4th night, they struck. Clara had just boiled beans, her hands blistered from rope burn, when the sky lit orange behind them. Supplies, everything tied to a pack mule, had been doused in oil and set ablaze. The flames clawed at the night, and for a moment, it looked like the canyon itself had opened to spit fire. They ran to it, too late. Blankets, salt, grain, gone, all gone. Then came the next blow. The water barrel left had been poisoned, cow urine or worse. Clara tasted it before letting the others touch it. Spat it out, cursed low and sharp. Tommy paled. We're finished. No, Clara said. They want us to think that. But I've known worse. This ain't ruin. It's just war. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat with the Winchester across her lap and watched the stars, the dying fire, and the shadow of Jonas Hale beside her. You ever lose a herd? She asked him. He didn't look at her. No, but I've lost things harder. She nodded slowly. I'll see this herd to market, even if it costs me my soul. Jonas turned. Just don't let it cost the boy his. Clara didn't answer. At dawn, Jonas scouted ahead while she gathered what cattle remained. She tied Tommy's belt tighter, adjusted his hat, and looked him in the eye. You ride beside me, she said. No matter what you hear. Don't turn. Don't look back. He nodded, jaw set. The trail curved around a gnarled cottonwood tree that stood alone like it had once been part of a forest. It marked the canyon's throat, where the land opened toward freedom, or toward ambush. Clara rode ahead, every muscle tight. Wind hissed low in the brush. A buzzard circled overhead, silent. Then she saw it. Jonas. Hanging. Rope looped tight around his throat, boots dragging inches above the ground. His hat lay beside him in the dirt, like a headstone. The cottonwood creaked under his weight, and the morning light painted him gold. Tommy screamed. Clara didn't. She rode forward, rifle raised, heart a war drum. From the shadows beyond the tree, laughter bloomed. You picked a hell of a partner, widow, the gang leader called. Guess he didn't shoot as straight as they said. She stared at Jonas, at the stillness of him, and something inside her broke, not with sorrow, but with fire, because she knew Jonas Hale. And she knew that even in death, he wasn't done yet. The night burned with more than fire. It burned with fury, with resolve, with the kind of quiet that comes before thunder. Clara rode through the canyon's shadow with her hat low and her rifle resting cold against her leg. Tommy clung to her left flank, pale and shaking, but still riding. Behind them, the cattle murmured nervously, their breath white in the cold air, sensing war was near. Jonas hung like a whisper that wouldn't die. A body on a rope, feet just above the dust, spinning slightly with the wind. But Clara had seen something the gang hadn't, a twitch in the fingers, the faintest kick in the boot. He wasn't gone. Not yet. The gang had made their camp just over the ridge, tucked into a low basin where the rocks curved like a bowl and the cottonwoods leaned in as if listening. They had a fire going, too bright for men that wicked. Bottles passed hand to hand. Laughter rose like flies off a carcass. And in the center of it all sat Luke, the betrayer, eating stew beside the men who would have cut his throat if not for the weight of Clara's herd. She waited until the moon ducked behind a cloud, and then she moved. The mare leapt down the slope like it had wings. Clara rode low in the saddle, rifle drawn, hair whipping behind her like smoke. The outlaws barely had time to turn before the first shot cracked through the camp. One man fell backward into the fire, screaming as flames found whiskey on his coat. Another stumbled and dropped his pistol as a second shot tore through his thigh. "God Almighty!" someone yelled. "She's here. The widow's here." Clara was already on her third shot, cutting through canvas and flesh with equal precision. Her eyes were calm. Her hands didn't tremble. She was no longer a woman. She was a fury on horseback, an echo of every wrong done to the quiet, the outnumbered, the overlooked. The cattle heard the gunfire and panicked. One steer bolted, then another, and soon the whole herd was stampeding toward the canyon mouth. Hoofs thundered across hardpan. Dust exploded. The ground shook. In the middle of the chaos, Clara's mare pivoted hard toward the cottonwood. Jonas hung limp, rope biting into his throat, lips blue. She charged. One outlaw raised his pistol to block her path. She shot him clean through the heart without blinking. He dropped before his finger even twitched. She reached Jonas in a single breath. Standing in the stirrups, she slashed the rope with her skinning knife, and his body dropped like stone into her arms. The mare staggered, then caught her balance as Clara dragged Jonas upright and slapped his face. "Breathe, damn you," she hissed. "Don't you go quiet on me now." He gasped once, just enough to prove her right. She dropped him onto the ground, pulled his knife from his belt, and shoved it into his hand. "Earn that legend." Then she turned. Luke was running. She saw him at the edge of the basin, stumbling over rocks, trying to make the ridge. Clara galloped after him, blood pounding in her ears. She reached him just before he cleared the rise. Her rifle barrel cracked across his back, and he hit the dirt face first, coughing sand. "No, please," he wheezed. "Hands up." She dismounted slowly, boots crunching on gravel, eyes lit by the fires behind her. "You sold me out." He whimpered. "They said they'd spare me. I didn't think." "You sold me out," she said again, voice cold and flat as iron. "You gave them my trail, my water, my herd. You left me for dead. I had no choice. You had a name once. You gave it up for coin. I just wanted to live." Clara pressed the rifle barrel to his forehead. "So did Jonas. So did every calf in that stampede. So did I." His mouth opened to beg, but she didn't want his begging. She turned the rifle, flipped it, and slammed the stock into his temple. He collapsed, out cold, bleeding into the dust. She didn't kill him. Not tonight. But the mark would stay. He'd wear it forever. Behind her, the fire raged. The basin was smoke and screams and fury. Jonas had crawled to a fallen rifle and was now trading fire with two outlaws who hadn't run fast enough. Tommy was herding a pocket of cattle away from the flames, his small frame almost invisible in the chaos. And from the far side of the camp, a familiar voice called out, "You ride hard, widow, but not hard enough." She turned. The gang leader stepped from the shadows, revolver raised, the silver of it gleaming in the firelight. His eyes were calm. "No panic. Just that awful grin. Thought I'd let you go easy," he said. Clara didn't answer. She lifted the Winchester. He fired. Time froze with a pull of her finger. Clara's rifle kicked like a horse, recoil slamming her shoulder as the muzzle lit the night with a bloom of fire. The outlaw's revolver barked a heartbeat later, but his aim wavered, off by inches that meant everything. His bullet hissed past her cheek, close enough to feel but never meant to touch. Hers struck home. The gang leader staggered, a sudden silence spreading through him like smoke. He looked down, blinked once, then dropped his gun. It hit the dirt with a thud too soft for a weapon that had killed men. He fell backward into the dust, the firelight dancing on his still chest, his grin wiped clean for good. Clara didn't lower the rifle right away. Her breath came slow, measured, steady. She scanned a basin, but the others were gone, scattered like jackals when the lion turns. Only the dying fire remained, its glow painting the rocks orange, the silence broken only by the wheezing of wounded men and the soft lowing of lost cattle. Behind her, Jonas limped forward. His shirt was torn, blood streaking one side of his ribs, but his eyes were sharp, and his rifle hung loose in one hand. He stopped beside the fallen leader, nudged the man's boot with his toe, and exhaled like he'd been holding something in for a year. "Hell of a shot," he said. Clara finally looked at him. Her hands trembled just a little now, the weight of the moment beginning to return to her bones. "He missed," she said. "I didn't. Seems that's how legends are made." She didn't answer. She just turned and walked to her mare, still saddled, still waiting. Tommy was rounding up strays with a look on his face somewhere between awe and exhaustion. The boy had grown in 3 nights. She didn't tell him that. She didn't need to. Jonas followed her to the herd. His gait was uneven, but his presence was steady, like a man finally walking toward something instead of away from it. "You ever think of not doing this alone?" he asked, wiping blood from his jaw. "You've got grit. I've got scars. Could make a damn fine team." Clara cinched her saddle and didn't meet his gaze. "This herd rides on my name," she said, voice low, calm, firm. "And my gun." Jonas smiled, but there was no offense in it. Only respect. "Then maybe I'll ride a mile behind. Just in case." They left the basin before dawn, smoke curling behind them like a memory trying to follow. The remaining cattle were battered but alive. 42 head strong, 1 mule, 1 half-busted wagon, and 3 souls still breathing. That was enough. The trail narrowed as they pushed forward, the worst of the canyon behind them. The land softened by degrees, less stone, more grass, fewer vultures overhead. Clara kept the rifle within arm's reach even when the stars faded. Trusted no place on her saddle horn. Jonas rode on the left flank, keeping an eye on stragglers. Tommy rode closer now, no longer afraid to be seen beside her. He carried his rope with more pride, called out commands with a voice that didn't crack anymore. She watched him ride and thought of the boy who trembled at every gunshot. That boy was gone. When the rooftops of Calico Ridge finally came into view over the hills, the herd quickened like they knew safety sat beyond those fences. Clara felt it too, relief laced with something deeper. She slowed her mare, letting the moment rise in her chest and settle in her throat. They came down the ridge 3 wide. The dirt street ran straight through town, lined with storefronts shaded by warped awnings. Folks came out of buildings like moths to flame, women with aprons still on, blacksmiths with soot-stained faces, children with wide eyes and dirty feet. No one spoke at first. Just the sight of her, Clara McGraw, the widow who'd left with 60 head and little else, riding back into town with a battered herd and the iron scent of gunpowder still on her coat. Then someone said her name. Not in a whisper, but like a bell being struck. "Clara." It passed through the crowd like wind through wheat. She rode past the general store, where Mr. Dobbins dropped his ledger. Past the saloon, where 2 men removed their hats without meaning to. Past the church, where the preacher stood on the steps and nodded once, solemn as a funeral. Tommy rode tall beside her. Jonas trailed a little behind, eyes sharp beneath his hat, but hands resting on the horn of his saddle like a man at peace. For now. At the stockyard gate, Clara reined in. She dismounted without a word, opened the corral herself, and watched the herd funnel through with the same care one might watch over a dream. Dust rose around her, clinging to her coat, her boots, her hair. But she didn't brush it away. Jonas came up beside her, handed his ribs, and looked down at the town watching them. He chuckled once. "Think they'll tell stories about this?" Clara didn't look at him. "They already are." She turned, walked to the center of the street, and stood where all could see her, plain as day, proud as thunder. The wind kicked up behind her, carrying with it the smell of cattle and sage and fire. And in the silence, as every eye stayed locked on her, the words seemed to rise from the dust, from the trail, from the blood and loss and steel that had carried her here. A gang threatened the widow's cattle drive, but they never knew she could shoot true from the saddle.